She pressed herself tighter against the cold floor, her heart hammering in her chest. The old desk above her creaked slightly as the floorboards beyond it groaned under slow, deliberate footsteps. "He can't see me here," she whispered to herself, trying to control the rising panic. The classroom, which had seemed so ordinary just hours ago, now felt like a cage. Every shadow, every distant sound made her flinch, and yet she knew she couldn't move. Not until he left. The classroom was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every small sound seem amplified. Dust motes floated lazily in the streams of late afternoon sunlight that slanted through the half-open blinds. The room smelled faintly of chalk, old wood, and a hint of pencil shavings. At the back, under a scratched and worn wooden desk, a girl curled into herself, knees drawn tightly to her chest. Her heart pounded in her chest so violently she thought it might give her away. She had been hiding here for what felt like hours, though in reality it had been only minutes since he had come into the classroom. The creak of the door had sent a jolt of fear through her body, and she had dropped silently to the floor, crawling beneath the desk as if the wood itself could shield her from the world. Every muscle in her body was tense. She could hear his footsteps as he moved slowly across the room, scanning the rows of desks, the shelves of books, the walls lined with faded posters. The girl pressed her face against her knees, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She remembered her mother's warning, "If you're ever in danger, stay calm, find a place where they can't see you, and breathe." She clutched the small notebook she had grabbed from her bag, the one with scribbles and half-finished homework, as though it were a talisman that could protect her from what might happen if she were discovered. Outside the window, the world seemed calm and ordinary. Birds flitted between the branches of the oak tree just beyond the playground. Children's laughter drifted faintly from the schoolyard, carried on a warm afternoon breeze. The contrast between the ordinary sounds outside and the terror she felt inside made the silence of the classroom feel heavier, almost suffocating. He moved closer, his shoes scuffing against the linoleum floor. Every step was deliberate, almost casual, but she knew it wasn't. He had been watching the room carefully, glancing at each desk as though expecting someone to be hiding beneath. The girl's stomach turned, a mix of fear and adrenaline tightening every muscle. She had to stay quiet, had to make herself disappear completely. She remembered the time her older brother had taught her to hide during games of hide-and-seek, but this was no game. There was no laughter here, no playful excitement. This was real, and she knew that even a single sound could change everything. A cough escaped her throat, soft and barely audible, and she pressed her hand against her mouth, willing it to stop. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft rustle of her movements and the occasional shifting of his weight. Her mind raced. How had it come to this? She had been walking back from the library, carrying her bag and thinking about the math homework she needed to finish. She remembered the figure emerging from the shadows near the door, the sudden sense of being followed, and then the cold, pressing fear that had forced her to dart into the classroom. Now, hidden beneath the old wooden desk, she felt the weight of every second pressing down on her. The desk itself was scratched and pitted with age. Graffiti etched into the wood told stories of students long gone, initials inside hearts, odd drawings, dates that no longer meant anything to anyone. She ran her fingers lightly across the surface above her, feeling the grooves and indentations, grounding herself in the texture, reminding herself that she was real, that this was real, and she could survive it. Her breathing slowed as she tried to control the panic rising inside her. In through the nose, out through the mouth. In through the nose, out through the mouth. She pictured a calm place, somewhere safe, the garden behind her house, sunlight spilling over flowers and grass, her dog sitting loyally by her side. The visualization helped, if only slightly, to pull her from the edge of terror. The footsteps grew louder, closer now. She could hear the scraping of his fingers along the desks as he checked each one. Her stomach churned, and she felt her knees tremble beneath her arms. She pressed herself tighter against the floor, imagining that the desk itself could shield her completely. He stopped, just a few desks away. She could hear him muttering softly, perhaps talking to himself, perhaps thinking aloud. The words were indistinct, but the tone carried a menace that made her blood run cold. She clenched her fists, feeling the nails dig into her palms. She had to be invisible. She had to stay. He can't see me here. The room smelled of old varnish, chalk dust, and fear. Every sense was heightened, every nerve on edge. A soft creak made her flinch. It was the old floorboards under his weight. She imagined how quickly he could find her, how easily he could reach under the desk and pull her out. The thought sent a shiver up her spine. But she couldn't move. Not yet. Patience was her only ally. Her mind flashed to her parents, wondering if they would know she was gone. She had left her bag in the library, her books scattered, and now she feared the panic her absence might cause. She tried to hold on to thoughts of rescue, imagining someone would come, maybe a teacher, maybe a classmate, someone who could restore her sense of safety. She tried to trust that the world outside her small hiding space was still governed by ordinary rules, that help would come. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The footsteps moved again, retreating slightly, then returning in a different pattern. She strained her ears, catching every subtle sound, the slight rustle of papers, the soft squeak of the chair as he shifted position, the distant humming of a ventilation system overhead. Every sound could give her away, yet she remained perfectly still. She became one with the shadows beneath the desk, every heartbeat echoing in her mind like a drumbeat of survival. Time became a strange, elastic concept. The sunlight shifted, casting new angles of light across the floor, highlighting the dust motes that floated lazily in the golden haze. The room seemed frozen in this liminal space between safety and danger, the old desk her tiny fortress. She whispered to herself, barely moving her lips, "He can't see me here." Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. Eventually, the footsteps moved toward the door. She heard the handle turn, a pause, a soft curse, and then the distant slam as the door closed. The sound echoed in her ears, a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Her body remained coiled beneath the desk, muscles tense, waiting, ensuring it was truly safe before allowing herself a breath that carried more relief than air. Finally, slowly, she uncurling herself, inching out from under the old desk. Every movement was deliberate, careful, and deliberate, as though the slightest motion could undo her careful hiding. She touched the floor, the wooden desk, and the walls around her, reaffirming the reality she had navigated, the danger she had survived. The sunlight outside had begun to wane, casting long, distorted shadows across the classroom floor. The girl's small form remained crouched under the old desk, her fingers gripping the chipped edges of the wood for comfort. Each time the doorknob rattled, she flinched, holding her breath so sharply that it left her lungs aching. She could hear the faint scrape of shoes across the linoleum, the slow shuffle of someone moving deliberately, searching. Every tiny sound was amplified in her mind, twisting into a symphony of dread that made her chest tighten and her stomach churn. She had thought that hiding under the desk, pressed into the corner behind the filing cabinet, would be enough. The desk was old, with scratches and worn patches that gave her a sense of invisibility, as if it had absorbed decades of classroom secrets and could somehow shield her. But now, hearing the low murmur of his voice and the careful footsteps nearing her side of the room, she realized how fragile that illusion was. Her mind raced, trying to think of a plan. She knew the classroom well, the way the teacher's desk leaned slightly to the right, the position of the windows, the narrow aisle that led to the door. She had spent years in this space, yet in this moment, it felt like a labyrinth. Every familiar corner was suddenly fraught with danger. The girl's fingers traced the edge of the desk, feeling the grooves and dents, grounding herself in the only thing that felt certain, the desk beneath her. A shadow fell across the linoleum near the front of the room, stretching toward her hiding place. She pressed herself lower, wishing she could melt into the wood, wishing she could be anywhere but here. Her breathing slowed, careful and deliberate, trying to match the rhythm of the room. The faint scent of floor polish mixed with old paper reached her nose, grounding her in the reality of the space while reminding her that she was painfully exposed. Time seemed to stretch indefinitely. Each creak of the floor, each muffled step, sent jolts of fear through her body. She thought about running, about bolting for the door and risking being caught, but instinct told her that movement would betray her presence. Instead, she remained perfectly still, willing herself into invisibility, hoping he would pass by without noticing the small, curled figure beneath the desk. Her thoughts began to drift. She remembered the first time she had sat under this desk, years ago, hiding from a sudden storm, thinking it was a secret fort. Back then, it had been a place of comfort. Now, the same desk was a prison. How had it transformed so completely in her mind in just a few terrifying minutes? The contrast made her shiver, a mix of nostalgia and fear that clawed at her chest. The footsteps paused. A shadow loomed closer, stretching along the floor, a dark promise of discovery. The girl's eyes widened, scanning the cracks beneath the desk, searching for an escape. Her fingers gripped the desk legs so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The room felt impossibly still now, the faint hum of the heating system and the occasional squeak of the ceiling fan the only sounds. Every second was an eternity. A low murmur reached her ears, almost indecipherable, but enough to make her stomach twist. He was speaking, but not loudly, words too soft to catch, yet carrying a weight she instinctively understood. He was near, looking for her, and she was utterly alone, her only allies the shadows and the wormwood beneath her. Her mind raced for a plan, but her fear kept her frozen, rational thought drowned by adrenaline. She thought of the windows. They were too high, the frames old and brittle, and the outside seemed impossibly far. The door was behind him, a barrier she couldn't cross without being seen. Her body ached from crouching, from trying to make herself small enough to disappear, from holding her breath for fear of making a single sound. Sweat pricked her temples, and her stomach churned as the tension built. Suddenly, a pen rolled across the floor, clattering against a chair leg. The sound was sharp, impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. Her heart jumped into her throat. The footsteps froze. A hand reached down toward the pen, lifting it, and the shadow shifted slightly. The girl's chest tightened. She remained perfectly still, willing the moment to stretch into eternity. The footsteps retreated, just slightly, and she dared to breathe, shallow and careful. Her mind spun with relief and terror all at once. She knew it was only temporary, he hadn't left, and she hadn't moved. But for now, she had survived another heartbeat. Her fingers relaxed slightly, letting go of the desk edge, though her body remained coiled like a spring, ready to shrink further if necessary. Minutes passed. Her ears strained for any sound, any clue that he was coming back. Her throat was dry, and her muscles ached, but she remained under the desk, curled into herself. The fear was a constant presence, gnawing at the edges of her resolve, but with each passing second, her determination grew. She would not be discovered. She would not be caught. Not yet. In the silence, her mind began to wander to other thoughts, thoughts of safety, of light, of the world beyond the walls of this classroom. She thought of home, of the familiar, of comfort. And in those fleeting moments, she drew strength, a quiet resilience born from the certainty that she could endure, that she could survive, and that perhaps, just perhaps, she would find a way out of this darkness. The room remained quiet, yet the tension was palpable. Every shadow, every creak, every hint of movement carried the thread of discovery. And yet, despite the fear, the girl remained steadfast, a small figure under the old desk, hidden but vigilant, determined to survive until the danger passed, until she could reclaim her freedom, one careful breath at a time. The shadows in the classroom deepened as the evening crept closer, painting the room in muted oranges and grays. The girl stayed pressed under the old desk, her back scraping against the rough wood, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. She could hear the faint creak of the floorboards above, a sound that made her flinch every time. Whoever was searching the classroom was methodical, deliberate. Her heart raced with each shuffle, each whisper of movement, and yet she knew she had to remain perfectly still. Outside, the hallway remained quiet. The occasional murmur of voices drifted through the partially open door, but no one entered. She pressed her ear to the wooden underside of the desk and tried to decipher whether the voices belonged to him. She had seen him before, glimpsed his shadow in the hallway when no one else was around. The memory of his cold eyes sent shivers down her spine. Her mind raced through every possible plan. Could she slip out unnoticed? Could she make it to the door without him seeing her? Each option seemed more impossible than the last. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were inching closer, pressing her into the corner. The old desk groaned under her weight, a sound that seemed deafening in the tense silence. She held her breath, willing the noise to vanish, wishing she could become invisible. Minutes stretched like hours. Every small creak of the floor made her flinch, every shifting shadow sent a jolt of fear through her. She thought about the times she had hidden as a child, pretending to be invisible during innocent games, and the stark contrast of now made her chest tighten. This was no game. This was survival. Her eyes darted across the floor, scanning for anything she could use. The room was littered with scraps of paper, forgotten pencils, and broken rulers. She gripped a small wooden ruler, feeling the splinters dig into her palm. Perhaps it wouldn't help, but it gave her a small sense of security. Her breathing became shallow, almost imperceptible. She could hear the scrape of a chair somewhere across the room. Someone had moved it slowly, carefully, testing the space. Time seemed to stretch and warp. She didn't know how long she had been under the desk. Her legs ached, her arms cramping from holding herself in a tight position. Her mind flickered between panic and desperate calmness. She forced herself to focus on her senses. The smell of old wood, the faint metallic tang of fear in her nose, the warmth of the sunlight fading through the blinds, all of it grounded her in the present. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the desk. Her body froze, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might betray her hiding place. A hand reached down, fingers brushing against the floor as if testing the space beneath. Her body shrank tighter, and she felt the splinters of the wooden desk bite into her skin. She remained utterly still, praying that the shadow would pass. Every second stretched, and she counted them silently, focusing only on holding herself still enough to avoid detection. The creak of the floorboards moved slowly across the room, then paused. She could hear breathing, slow and deliberate, the kind that seemed to echo in the tense silence. The shadow lingered. She held her breath, willing the seconds to stretch into eternity, her mind a whirl of fear and hope. If he discovered her, everything would change in an instant. Minutes later, the sound of retreating footsteps echoed faintly. She remained motionless, muscles aching, waiting for the sense of danger to fully pass. Her chest heaved as she allowed herself a small exhale, the tiniest hint of relief mixing with the overwhelming tension. Her mind struggled to process what had just happened. She knew this was only the beginning. As the room grew darker, the fading light cast strange patterns across the floor. She began to plan her next moves. How could she escape? Could she wait until he left completely? Or should she make a sudden run for it? Each thought seemed more terrifying than the last. She hugged herself tightly, pressing against the cool floorboards, trying to find a small measure of comfort in the terrifying uncertainty of the moment. Her eyes kept darting to the classroom door. She could hear distant footsteps in the hallway again, muffled voices, and the faint shuffle of feet approaching. Panic surged again, but she fought to control it. She focused on the small things, her heartbeat, the feel of the floor beneath her, the tiny movements of the desk as she shifted slightly to ease her cramps. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in a blur of fear and tension. She learned to control her reactions, to mask every twitch and movement. She became attuned to the room, every shadow, every noise, every breath of air. The old desk became a sanctuary, a protector in the midst of danger. It was narrow and uncomfortable, but it kept her out of sight. As night began to fall, the shadows deepened. She felt the room shrink further, pressing her to a heightened state of alertness. But with the darkness came a tiny sense of opportunity. The dim light would conceal her better than the fading sunlight. She could hear the faint creak of someone walking back and forth in the hallway, perhaps searching systematically. She felt her pulse slow just slightly, learning to mask the fear in her body, to become as quiet and unnoticed as possible. Every second under that desk taught her something: patience, control, and the terrifying weight of being hunted. She realized that survival depended not on strength but on silence, invisibility, and the ability to wait. The night promised challenges ahead, but for now, she remained curled under the old desk, heart racing, listening, breathing, and surviving. The dim light from the corridor filtered through the cracks around the classroom door, creating thin lines that stretched across the floor. The girl hugged her knees tighter, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible under the old desk. Her breathing was shallow, her ears straining for any sound, any clue that could tell her whether he had moved on or was still searching. Each creak of the floorboard above made her flinch, each shift of the desk legs beneath her added to the tension that gripped her tightly. She remembered the first moments after he had entered the classroom. It had been a normal afternoon until she had seen him standing at the doorway, his shadow stretching long and dark over the floor. Panic had surged through her, a cold wave that made her limbs go rigid. Without thinking, she had dropped silently under the desk, pulling her legs up and pressing herself as close to the wood as possible. The smell of dust and old paper had filled her senses, grounding her in the tiny, suffocating space. Time stretched, becoming elastic, each second heavier than the last. The distant ticking of a wall clock seemed unnaturally loud, marking each heartbeat as if reminding her that she could not afford a single misstep. She could feel the faint vibrations of footsteps across the room, the subtle movement of air as the intruder passed by, and her own pulse thrumming so loudly it felt almost audible. She remembered the old desk's grooves and scratches, evidence of years of use by students who had long since left. In a strange way, it felt protective, as though the worn wood had absorbed the whispers and fears of generations before her. She pressed her cheek against it, feeling its rough texture against her skin, trying to remind herself of something solid, something real, amidst the chaos of fear and anticipation. A sudden sound, metal against metal, made her freeze completely. It was brief, almost imperceptible, yet in the tense silence it screamed. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had he noticed her movement? Was he reaching under the desk? She forced herself to stay still, counting her breaths in a desperate attempt to maintain control over the mounting panic. Hours, it seemed, passed in this torturous stillness. She lost track of time, aware only of the noises that threatened to betray her hiding place. Occasionally, a flicker of doubt would pass through her mind: perhaps she was trapped, perhaps no one would find her in time. But a deeper instinct, something primal, kept her steady, reminding her that she had to survive this. Her thoughts drifted briefly to her family, to the safe world she had taken for granted that morning. The memory of her mother's voice, soft and coaxing, echoed in her mind. She remembered the warmth of her father's hand on her shoulder as they had left the house. Those thoughts, fleeting as they were, gave her strength. She focused on them, letting them act as tiny anchors in a storm that threatened to engulf her entirely. Then, the room fell silent in a way that felt heavier than any noise. She could sense him still searching, still methodical, but now slower, almost deliberate in his movements. Her heart pounded in anticipation, a silent drumbeat of fear. Every instinct screamed at her to remain completely still, to become part of the shadows, to let the desk and the darkness hide her entirely. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Her body cramped, her arms ached from holding herself in a tight, curled position, but she could not allow herself to move. Every nerve was taut, every sense heightened. She could hear the subtle shifts of clothing, the faint scraping of shoes, the whisper of a voice just beyond the doorway. Each sound sent a shiver through her spine. She wondered how long she could endure this, how long her courage could hold. The fear was almost physical, pressing down on her chest, making each breath a deliberate effort. Yet she clung to it, to the smallest hope that she would not be discovered, that the shadows in the desk would shield her until the danger passed. A single ray of light from the window hit the edge of the desk, illuminating a small patch of the floor. She realized how exposed she was, how fragile her hiding place seemed against the vastness of the room. Yet, even in that moment of stark clarity, a strange calm settled over her. She had survived so far. She could survive a little longer. She focused on the rhythm of her breathing, the silent mantra of her own heartbeat, and the faint but steady awareness of her surroundings. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice told her to hold on, to endure, to trust in her own instinct and strength. She pressed herself further into the shadows, curling tighter under the old desk, and resolved that no matter what, she would not give herself away. She would wait, she would endure, and she would survive. The classroom had grown darker, the fading sunlight casting long, shifting shadows that danced across the walls and floor. The girl remained curled beneath the old desk, her small body tense and rigid, as if she could somehow make herself disappear entirely. Her mind raced with thoughts, questions of what would happen if he found her, if anyone else would come, if she would ever get out of this alive. Every sound, even the faintest whisper or the shuffle of feet down the corridor, sent a jolt of fear through her. She tried to steady her breathing, counting silently in her mind, 1, 2, 3, 4. It was a technique she had read about once, in a book about mindfulness, but now it was a lifeline. Her fingers dug into the edge of the desk, her knuckles white with tension, as she pressed herself closer to the cold, dusty floor. The faint smell of old paper, wax polish, and the lingering scent of the classroom, a mixture of crayons and cleaning fluid, made her stomach churn. Outside the classroom, the hallway was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The sound of distant footsteps echoed softly, bouncing off the lockers and walls, giving her a fleeting hope that someone might come to check on the building, that she might be rescued before it was too late. Yet the shadow of fear loomed larger, gnawing at her with each passing second. She could feel the tension of waiting stretch out, each heartbeat a reminder of her precarious situation. Every so often, she heard a creak from above, a floorboard shifting, perhaps someone moving in the room above. Her mind imagined the worst possibilities, painting vivid pictures of him discovering her hiding place. She pressed herself even tighter against the floor, closing her eyes for just a fraction of a second, trying to disappear into the shadows. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, a cruel trick of her fear, each minute a decade, each second a small eternity. The old desk under which she hid was scarred with scratches and dents, the result of years of use and abuse. Its wooden surface was rough against her cheek, but it gave her a strange sense of safety, a physical barrier between her and the unknown threat lurking nearby. She tried to memorize every detail, the pattern of scratches, the small splinter near the back leg, the faint pencil marks on the underside. Every detail could become a lifeline in her memory, a way to orient herself if she ever had to move silently in the dark. Her thoughts wandered briefly to the outside world, the safety of home, the warmth of her parents, the sunlight she had taken for granted. The memories made her throat tighten with emotion, a mix of longing and fear. She wished desperately for someone to call out her name, for a familiar voice to break through the tension and reassure her that she was not alone. Yet, in the oppressive silence of the classroom, she realized that she was utterly alone in that moment, entirely dependent on her own wits and her ability to remain unseen. Suddenly, a faint sound from the hallway made her freeze completely, a soft thud, like the drop of a small object. Her pulse spiked, and she could feel her hands trembling against the desk legs. She forced herself to stay calm, listening intently as the sound echoed once, then faded. She allowed herself a shallow breath, silently willing herself to remain unnoticed. Every sense was heightened, the faint smell of the cleaning fluid, the distant hum of the ventilation system, even the vibration of the building beneath her, all of it became part of her awareness. Minutes passed like hours. She kept reminding herself to stay still, to breathe slowly, to control the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. Her back ached from crouching in the cramped space, her legs numb and stiff, but she could not risk moving. Any sudden motion could reveal her, and she could not allow that. The fear had become almost physical, pressing down on her chest and making her stomach churn with nausea. She began to whisper to herself, words barely audible, a mantra to keep her grounded: stay quiet, stay calm, don't move, don't let him see you. The repetition became a small comfort, a fragile shield against the rising tide of terror. Her eyes darted to the cracks in the desk, imagining them as tiny windows to the hallway beyond, trying to gauge the movements of whoever was outside. Every shadow, every flicker of light seemed laden with menace, every creak of the floor a possible threat. Hours seemed to stretch on, and exhaustion began to weigh heavily on her. Her eyelids grew heavy, but she could not allow herself to sleep. Every instinct screamed that she had to remain alert, to watch and wait. Her body ached from remaining in one position, but the thought of moving, even slightly, filled her with terror. She forced herself to take tiny sips of water from her bottle, careful not to spill a drop or make a sound. Through the long, oppressive silence, she began to notice other details: the faint tapping of raindrops beginning against the classroom windows, the soft rustle of papers left on other desks, and the distant hum of traffic from outside the building. Each sound became a reminder of the world outside, a distant reality that seemed almost unattainable in the darkness of her hiding place. Despite the fear, she began to steel herself with a fragile determination. She knew that her survival depended on patience, on vigilance, and on the hope that the danger outside would pass. Her mind cycled through strategies: how she might escape if the door opened, where she could run, how she could stay silent while moving. Each plan was imagined in careful detail, rehearsed silently under her breath, until they became almost second nature, mental rehearsals for survival. And through it all, she remained under the old desk, curled tightly into herself, a fragile figure of fear and resilience, silently waiting for the next sound, the next movement, the next chance to survive. The shadows in the classroom had deepened to a near black as the last remnants of sunlight disappeared behind the school's tall brick walls. The girl's small frame remained pressed under the old wooden desk, trembling slightly as she listened intently to every faint sound. Her fingers clutched the edge of the desk, nails digging into the worn wood, grounding herself in the only thing that felt real in that moment. She could hear his slow footsteps moving deliberately across the linoleum floors, the soft scrape of his shoes against the dusty hallway, the faint jingle of keys or a tool he carried. She dared not move. She could feel her heart hammering violently in her chest, threatening to give her away, each beat echoing in her ears like a drum. Her mind raced with memories of what had brought her here. Earlier that afternoon, everything had seemed normal. She had walked into the classroom, greeted the few friends still lingering from lunch, and sat down to finish her assignment. But then he appeared, a shadow she couldn't ignore, a presence that made her stomach twist in fear. The girl's eyes flicked to the small gap between the desk's legs and the floor. She considered slipping out, running, hiding elsewhere, but the hallway was empty except for him. And she knew, somehow, that if he saw her leave this spot, it would be over. She had to wait. Patience, she told herself, patience. Her thoughts drifted to the desk itself. It had been here for decades, scratched and carved with names and initials, stories of students long gone. She pressed her cheek against the cold wood, feeling the grooves and marks beneath her skin. In some strange way, it offered comfort. It had stood here through years of laughter, lessons, and secrets. Now, it was her shield, her protector. Outside the classroom door, he paused. She could hear him breathing, low and deliberate. The sound sent a fresh wave of terror through her body, and she squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to vanish into the shadows beneath the desk. The quiet creak of the door as it opened a fraction startled her, and she froze completely, not daring to even blink. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time had lost all meaning. Every tick of the clock on the wall was amplified in her ears, each second stretching into an eternity. She focused on controlling her breathing, counting again silently, 1, 2, 3, each number a small anchor keeping her from panicking entirely. Her mind wandered to her family, to the people who would worry if she didn't return home soon. She imagined their faces, the panic, the search. It made her heart ache and fueled a resolve she didn't know she had. She had to survive. She had to stay hidden, no matter how long it took. A soft sound made her stiffen once more. He was moving, just beyond the desk, stepping cautiously, almost as if he could sense her presence. She held her breath so tightly she feared she might pass out, yet she refused to move, refused to make any noise. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but she stayed. Then, suddenly, a faint noise echoed from the far side of the classroom, a chair scraping, a locker door rattling. The girl's eyes darted toward the sound, and for a brief moment, a flicker of hope ignited. Perhaps someone else was here. Perhaps someone would notice him first. Perhaps she might just make it out alive. The footsteps drew closer again. She could smell him now, a faint metallic tang in the air, like the smell of old keys and leather, and it made her stomach twist with nausea. But she stayed, curled tight under the desk, counting, breathing, waiting. And then, unexpectedly, he paused. She could hear the subtle shuffle of his weight shifting, a low murmur as if talking to someone else, or muttering to himself. The girl's mind raced. Was he confused? Did he suspect something? Her pulse throbbed painfully, but a small spark of courage began to take root. Her hand brushed against a fallen pencil beneath the desk. She stared at it for a moment, contemplating. Could she use it? Should she stay completely passive, letting him underestimate her? Every instinct screamed differently, and yet she remained still as the desk itself, almost merging with its worn surface, becoming nothing more than another shadow in the dim room. Time seemed suspended. The world outside the desk didn't exist, and the only reality was the space beneath it, the sanctuary, the trap, the silent witness to her fear. She realized that this moment, suspended between discovery and safety, was shaping her in ways she could not yet comprehend. Courage, fear, patience, desperation, they all coalesced into a singular will, survival. Slowly, imperceptibly, the footsteps began to move away. She dared not breathe until the sounds receded completely, until the faint echo of his presence faded into the distance. Only then did she release her grip on the desk, trembling with exhaustion, her muscles stiff and aching from holding her position. She peeked out just slightly, making sure he had truly gone. In that moment, the girl understood something fundamental. Hiding wasn't just a temporary tactic, it was a test of patience, of nerve, of wits. And she had passed this round. But the night was still long, and she knew the danger wasn't over. Somewhere out there, he remained. Somewhere out there, the threat loomed. And she would have to remain vigilant, brave, and clever to survive until help arrived. The night had settled over the school grounds, leaving the classrooms bathed in the eerie glow of dim emergency lights. The girl remained hidden under the old desk, her small body pressed tightly against the cold wooden floor. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, yet she knew that even the slightest movement could betray her location. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, and each exhale sounded far too loud in the oppressive silence. She could hear the distant hum of a fan somewhere in the hallway, the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe, and the faint, unmistakable creak of the floorboards above her. Her mind raced through every possibility. She had tried to think of safe places in the classroom, places she could have run if only she had acted faster. But now, the old desk felt like both her protector and her prison. The drawers underneath, stuffed with forgotten papers and broken pencils, provided a barrier between her and the danger that lurked above. She wrapped her arms tightly around her knees, pressing her forehead against them, trying to block out the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The sound of footsteps grew louder, slower, methodical. Whoever was in the building was searching with intent, moving deliberately as if they knew she was here somewhere, waiting. Her heart pounded so violently that she thought it would give her away, and yet she forced herself to remain perfectly still. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her own breathing, counting silently to 5 and then exhaling, trying to slow the panic that threatened to consume her. Outside the classroom, the hallways were empty, but the echo of the footsteps made it impossible to tell exactly where he was. The girl listened, straining to distinguish the direction, the distance, any clue that might tell her whether she was still safe or already in grave danger. She could feel the worn floorboards beneath her pressing into her cheek, rough and cold, a stark reminder of the reality of her situation. Time stretched, each second dragging into the next, indistinguishable from the last. The girl's mind wandered to thoughts of escape, imagining herself slipping quietly out of the classroom and running down the empty hallways, her shoes whispering against the linoleum. But every plan she imagined ended with the same terrifying conclusion: she was trapped, and any movement might be her undoing. She remembered the way he had entered the room earlier, the shadow of his figure stretching across the doorway, the glint of his eyes catching the dim light. That fleeting glimpse was burned into her memory, a constant reminder of why she could not move, why she had to remain under the desk, silent and unseen. Every creak of the floor, every faint rustle of paper, every subtle shift in the air made her flinch, yet she held her position, refusing to give him any hint of her presence. Minutes passed like hours. The footsteps receded, moving farther away, and the girl's body sagged slightly with relief. She allowed herself a shallow breath, careful not to make a sound, as her mind replayed every terrifying moment of the day. She had learned, in those few hours of terror, how quickly fear could sharpen every sense, how it could make the smallest sound feel deafening, the dimmest shadow appear threatening. Yet even in her terror, there was a flicker of resilience. She had survived this long by staying hidden, by trusting her instincts, and by refusing to allow panic to control her actions. She pressed herself even tighter into the desk, willing herself to remain as small and invisible as possible, knowing that her life depended on it. From somewhere deeper in the building came the faint sound of a door closing, followed by the distant murmur of voices. Her pulse quickened again, uncertainty clawing at her chest. Were they coming back? Had he left? She could not tell, and the not knowing was almost as terrifying as being found. She remained still, listening to the echoes in the hallways, waiting for any clue that might indicate what to do next. Her mind wandered again, this time to the outside world, to the freedom she had taken for granted before this nightmare began. The thought of running through open fields, the wind against her face, and the warmth of sunlight felt like a dream too distant to grasp. And yet, it was that very memory that gave her a spark of hope, a reason to continue hiding, to continue surviving. Hours seemed to pass as she remained under the desk, each one filled with tension, fear, and the constant struggle to maintain control over her trembling body. She reminded herself that the smallest sound could betray her, that even a single whisper of panic could bring him back to her. And so she remained, silent and still, a shadow beneath the old wooden desk, waiting for the right moment to act, waiting for the nightmare to end. The faint creak of the classroom door being pushed open startled her. Her eyes darted to the gap, but the figure that appeared was not the one she had feared. It was a janitor, moving slowly with a mop bucket, humming softly to himself, completely unaware of the girl curled beneath the desk. Relief washed over her in a wave, so strong that she nearly wept, but she restrained herself, knowing that even the slightest noise could still draw attention. She stayed hidden for several more minutes, listening as he moved around the room, cleaning and humming, oblivious to the terror that had unfolded here earlier. Only when he finally exited, leaving the door ajar behind him, did she allow herself a cautious breath of relief, her body still tense, ready to spring into action if needed. The girl realized that surviving this ordeal required more than just hiding. It required patience, observation, and the ability to control fear in a way that she had never imagined possible. Each passing minute was a test, each sound a challenge, and she had met them all with courage she had not known she possessed. Finally, with the room empty and silent once more, she slowly emerged from her hiding place, her movements deliberate and quiet. She touched the floor lightly with her fingertips, feeling the rough texture of the worn linoleum, the dust beneath the old desk, and allowed herself to take a small, careful step forward. The journey was not over, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that she might see safety, freedom, and daylight once more. The classroom seemed to shrink around her as the night deepened. Shadows stretched and twisted in strange, almost threatening forms across the walls, cast by the dim light that seeped through the cracks of the blinds. The girl stayed pressed under the old desk, her body tense, her mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if he found her. Her fingers traced the grooves in the worn wood, trying to anchor herself in something tangible while fear and adrenaline coursed through her. She thought back to the moment she had first realized she wasn't safe. It had been a normal afternoon until the unexpected shadow of his presence fell over the room. She remembered the soft but deliberate creak of the door opening, the faint click of his shoes on the floor, and the way her stomach had dropped in a sudden, cold panic. That first moment of recognition, that he was here and searching, had sent her scrambling for the only hiding place she could see, the old desk in the back corner of the classroom. Curled tightly beneath it, she had tried to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She had pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and pressed her forehead against the edge of the wooden panel, trying to steady the rapid pounding of her heart. Every noise was amplified in her mind. The scrape of the chair legs, the whisper of paper shifting on the desks, the distant echo of footsteps outside the room, they all threatened to give her away. Time stretched endlessly. Each minute felt like an hour, each hour like a day. Her muscles ached from holding herself still, but she could not risk moving. The desk offered only a small pocket of space, a temporary refuge, and she knew she had to stay inside it until she could figure out a way to escape. She listened intently, catching each subtle sound, the faint murmur of voices drifting from the hallway, the distant slam of a locker, the shuffle of footsteps near the classroom door. Every noise tightened a knot of fear in her chest. She remembered the whispered advice her mother had given her when she was younger: breathe, stay calm, and think. She repeated those words silently, trying to summon courage, but the fear made it hard to concentrate. Her mind oscillated between panic and planning, between the desperate hope that someone might come to help and the grim reality that she might be completely alone. Suddenly, a sound made her freeze, a soft click, almost inaudible, the distinct sound of the door handle turning slowly. Her eyes widened as she pressed herself even closer to the floor, trying to merge with the shadows. He was entering. She could feel his presence like a weight in the air, the anticipation building as the door opened with an almost imperceptible creak. Every muscle in her body tensed, every nerve alert to the slightest movement. He moved slowly, deliberately, scanning the room with a practiced gaze. The girl could feel the fear surging, but she forced herself to remain silent, to remain still. She could see the shadow of his legs through the gap between the desk and the floor, the faint glint of something in his hand, and the soft sound of his breathing. Time seemed to stretch into infinity as she waited, barely daring to blink. Her mind worked frantically. She had to find a way out, but moving would reveal her immediately. She thought of the classroom windows, the emergency exit at the back, the hallway leading to the main doors. Each option carried risk, and each risk could be fatal if he discovered her. She had to stay under the desk, at least for now, and wait for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to slip away unnoticed. As he stepped closer, the wooden floor creaking under his weight, the girl could feel her pulse in her throat. The desk seemed impossibly small, the space around her unbearably tight, yet she clung to it as her sanctuary. She tried to slow her breathing, count her heartbeats, and keep her mind clear. She imagined herself outside, running down the hall, the door slamming behind her, the night air filling her lungs. That vision was the only thing that kept her from panicking completely. Minutes passed like hours. The shadow moved, paused, and then receded slightly. Her fingers dug into the wood, nails leaving shallow scratches as she braced herself. She heard him mutter under his breath, a low, barely audible sound that made her stomach twist with dread. She didn't understand the words, but the intent was clear. He was searching, he was close, and he was focused. Suddenly, another sound drew his attention elsewhere, a distant shout, the echo of footsteps in the corridor. The girl's stomach clenched with hope as he paused, listening. She stayed perfectly still, counting every heartbeat, willing him to turn away. Slowly, he shifted, heading toward the back of the classroom, leaving her under the desk, invisible, yet painfully aware of every movement he made. She exhaled slowly, silently, letting a fraction of the tension escape her body while keeping every sense sharp. She knew this was not over. The danger had not passed, but she had survived this moment. She reminded herself of the next steps she might take, the escape routes she could try, and the small glimmers of hope she could cling to. Under the old desk, curled into herself, she realized that fear was a tool. It sharpened her senses, heightened her awareness, and forced her to focus. Night deepened, shadows lengthened, and the classroom became a labyrinth of dark corners and hidden spaces. The girl stayed in her refuge, aware that every second counted, that every sound could signal safety or peril. She was small, alone, and yet her determination burned fiercely. She would not be caught. She would survive. And as she pressed herself closer to the desk, listening, planning, and waiting, she understood that courage was not the absence of fear, it was acting in spite of it. And so she waited, under the old desk, curled tightly, silent, alert, and ready for whatever came next. The quiet of the classroom was now almost unbearable. Every sound seemed amplified, the distant creak of the school roof settling, the rustle of papers in the empty hallways, and the occasional squeak of a locker door somewhere far away. The girl pressed herself tighter under the old desk, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them as if she could somehow disappear entirely. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, each pulse a reminder of her fragility, her smallness, and the danger that lurked just beyond the shadows. Time had become elastic in the darkness. Minutes stretched into hours, and yet each movement outside the desk felt like a lifetime. She could hear his slow, deliberate footsteps pacing in the hallway just beyond the classroom door. Every so often, he would pause, and she held her breath, listening for any clue of his intent. Was he searching specifically for her, or had he lost track of what he was doing? That thought made her shiver involuntarily. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Should she attempt to escape now, while he wasn't in the room? Or would that be certain death? Could she call out, scream for help, or would her voice betray her instantly? She forced herself to think logically, though logic felt weak and unreliable in the face of pure fear. The desk had become both her sanctuary and her cage. Every sound outside, the faint tapping of shoes against tiles, the soft whisper of the wind through a cracked window, the distant slam of a door, made her flinch. The world felt unbearably close and impossibly far at the same time. She tried to steady herself by counting quietly in her mind, 1, 2, 3, but her numbers became jumbled, swallowed by the oppressive tension that hung over the room like a heavy, suffocating fog. Her thoughts drifted to the small comforts she had known before this moment, the smell of crayons and old textbooks, the laughter of her friends echoing in these very halls, the gentle hum of teachers moving through classrooms. All of it felt distant now, like a life that belonged to someone else. She realized how fragile safety had been, how easily it could be torn away in an instant. The desk beneath her, once ordinary and unremarkable, now felt like the only thing keeping her tethered to a sliver of hope. The footsteps in the hallway slowed. She dared not look, fearing that any movement on her part would be immediately noticed. A shadow fell across the doorway, stretching long and sinister into the room. Her pulse quickened, and sweat began to bead at her hairline. She could smell the faint musk of the hall, the old wooden floorboards, and even the scent of him, the presence that made her stomach tighten with terror. Minutes passed, or was it hours? The hallway remained eerily silent, save for the occasional distant sound. She forced herself to focus on the texture of the desk beneath her palms, the grooves worn smooth by decades of student hands. That focus became her anchor, a lifeline to reality amid the nightmare she had been thrust into. She whispered softly to herself, words she hoped would give her courage. You are safe. You are hidden. You are unseen. Then, the sudden sound of the doorknob turning made her freeze completely. Her body went rigid as she pressed herself deeper into the narrow space under the desk. The door creaked, inching open slowly. She held her breath, every muscle taut, ready to respond to the slightest threat. He stepped into the room, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Its light danced across the walls, the floor, and finally the desk, but it never quite reached her. Her chest felt as though it would burst from the sheer force of her heartbeat. The beam of light lingered near the center of the room, moving slowly, deliberately, before finally retreating. He muttered under his breath, searching for some clue that she had left behind, some evidence of her presence. She remained perfectly still, every nerve screaming, but her body frozen in an instinctive silence that had kept her alive thus far. When the footsteps finally receded down the hallway, she allowed herself a tiny, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. But the fear didn't leave her, it lingered, a constant companion, a reminder that her safety was temporary and fragile. She remained under the desk, listening intently, waiting for the next sound, the next movement, the next threat. Hours seemed to pass in this way, each one feeling heavier than the last. The classroom was a prison of shadows and silence, yet paradoxically it was also a sanctuary. The girl had survived, hidden in the smallest, most overlooked space, relying on instinct, patience, and courage she hadn't known she possessed. In that darkness, under the old desk, she began to understand the complexity of fear, not just as something to endure, but as a force that could sharpen the senses, focus the mind, and demand ingenuity even in the most desperate circumstances. By the time the first hints of dawn began to filter through the blinds, she had not moved. The night had been long, unrelenting, and terrifying, but she had endured it. Her muscles ached, her fingers were stiff, and her body was tense, but there was a quiet, hard-earned sense of victory in simply having survived. She had hidden. She had survived. And somehow, she had grown stronger in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. The classroom, once a place of ordinary learning, had become a crucible in which fear and courage had met. And though the girl was still hidden, still under the old desk, she knew that the experience would leave an indelible mark on her. She had faced danger, endured it, and emerged with the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, she could find strength she hadn't known existed. The darkness in the classroom had deepened into a heavy, suffocating black. The faint glow from the emergency lights barely illuminated the edges of the room, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch toward the girl hiding under the old desk. Her body was tense, her muscles cramped from hours of remaining in the same position. Her small hands gripped the desk legs, nails digging into the wood, grounding herself to the one solid thing in a world that felt increasingly unstable. Outside, the faint murmur of voices had grown more distinct. She could hear the shuffle of shoes, the hurried whispers, and the distant sound of a door opening and closing. Her heart raced at every new noise, fear mingling with a flicker of hope that perhaps someone had realized she was missing and had come to find her. Her mind raced as she considered every possible outcome. If he found her, what would happen? She had imagined it countless times during the long minutes she had spent hiding, each scenario more terrifying than the last. And yet, she also imagined the possibility that she might be rescued, that someone might see the truth of her fear and act before it was too late. She thought about the classroom, its familiar walls, the old chalkboard with faint remnants of lessons past, the stacks of textbooks in the corner, the broken window that let in the occasional cool night breeze. It had once been a place of learning, of safety, of routine, but now it was a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty, each corner a potential threat. Minutes stretched on like hours, and still, she remained under the desk, unmoving, unheard, unseen. The creak of the floorboards outside shifted slightly, and she froze, straining her ears. The sound stopped abruptly, and she wondered if he had noticed something, if he was close, if her time to remain hidden was nearly over. Her thoughts drifted to her family, to the warmth of home, to the simple safety of her room. The contrast between that life and this moment made her chest tighten with longing and fear. She clung to the memory of those safe spaces as tightly as she clutched the desk legs, a lifeline in a night full of shadows and threats. Then, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost deliberate, almost careful. Her breath caught in her throat. It was close. Too close. The girl pressed herself tighter to the floor, willing herself to be invisible, willing herself to become nothing more than a shadow beneath the desk. The tapping moved slowly, circling the desk, and she could hear the subtle shift in weight, the soft creak of the floorboards. He was searching. He was very close. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to remain still. Every instinct screamed to run, but she knew that would be her undoing. Suddenly, the desk leg creaked under her weight. Her stomach dropped. She froze entirely, holding her breath as if the sound itself could betray her. The tapping stopped for a heartbeat, and then a soft, whispered curse came from somewhere above her. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable: anger, frustration, a subtle menace. Hours must have passed in that tense state, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had lost meaning in the oppressive darkness. Her body ached, her limbs cramped, but she could not move. She could only wait, her senses straining to catch every small sound, every subtle hint of movement. Then, unexpectedly, there was silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on her from all sides. She dared not move, did not even breathe for a long, tense moment. And then, softly, the sound of footsteps retreating, slow, deliberate, leaving the classroom behind. She didn't know why he left, didn't know if he had been called away or had grown frustrated, but she didn't question it. Relief and fear battled within her as the danger receded. Finally, she allowed herself a slow, trembling breath. Her arms uncurled slightly, and she peeked out from under the desk, scanning the room for any sign of movement. The classroom was still, bathed in the dim, flickering light from the emergency bulbs. The shadows remained, long and distorted, but the immediate threat seemed to have passed. She remained there for several more minutes, cautious, listening, waiting. Every fiber of her being was alert, yet slowly, a sense of cautious hope began to seep in. She realized that she had survived this ordeal, that she had remained unseen, unheard, untouched. As the night slowly gave way to the faint light of dawn, she finally emerged from under the old desk, her body stiff and sore, but her spirit unbroken. The classroom, once a place of fear, became a sanctuary in the soft morning light, a place where she had proven her strength, her courage, and her resilience. The girl stepped carefully across the floor, each movement deliberate, aware that her ordeal had changed her forever. She had survived the darkness, the fear, and the uncertainty. And as she finally reached the door, stepping out into the new day, she knew that she carried with her not just the memory of terror, but the unyielding strength that comes from facing it and surviving.